I love Shurima's storyline. Despite my initial resentment for it during the Great Retcon, I've come to grow deeply attached to this region, its characters, and its history. I genuinely think it's one of the best handled narratives in all of League's lore, at least until or unless Riot deletes half of it to fit their new arcane-centric canon. In spite of that, I still have a couple issues. Primary among them is the fact that certain parts of the Shuriman storyline feel extremely disconnected or like they have massive gaps missing. This is most evident in the two-part trailer for Azir's release, in which the second trailer just seems to sort of forget all about the antagonists. Like, where are Xerath, Renekton, and Cassiopeia while Azir is getting revived? Are they still in the tomb? Have they made it back up to the surface? Does Cassiopeia ever even interact with the mad demigod she set free? And what is Xerath's initial reaction to seeing the city he destroyed ages ago suddenly revived? Evidently, he doesn't think to investigate it because Azir's short story reveals that he doesn't know anything about what happened around his death until he basically uses the sands to Moody Blues his final moments and reveals Xerath's betrayal. In short, at no point are we led to believe that Azir and Xerath have even met in their ascended forms yet. There's also just the permeation of Riot's tendency to say that things just sort of happen because magic. Cassiopeia was bitten by a big stone snake statue, and its venom turned her into a snake lady with poison powers, rather than just killing her, I guess. Why is this a defense mechanism? Also, Azir was revived because Sivir conveniently bled onto the spot he died centuries ago, and he ascended because a convenient beam of sunlight struck him from somewhere underground. I know this is supposed to be proof of his quote-unquote worthiness to ascend, but Xerath's story makes it explicitly clear that this is BS. There is, of course, also the whole Darken situation that retroactively complicates the story of the Ascended. I've made my thoughts and feelings about the Darken quite clear on this channel a number of times, so I won't get too deep into that again. I know there are people who really love the Darken storyline as it is, but I am not one of them. This is my rewrite, so I'll be altering things how I please. With all of that being said, let's delve into it. This is Shurima Reimagined by yours truly. Our story begins millennia ago, in an age nearly lost to time. In those days, the land that would come to be called Shurima was a lush place, yet to be covered by the vast desert most know today. The continent was divided among many tribes, some peaceful, some not, but life was simple then. None knew the horrors that awaited them until it was far too late. The oldest legends speak of a day when the sky turned dark, just before it was set ablaze by a great star. High atop the slopes of the sacred Mount Targon, the gods did battle with an otherworldly evil, which threatened to consume all of creation. Horrors poured down from the slopes, devouring everything in their path. The people prayed for salvation, even as the sun, moon, and stars were blotted out from the heavens. And then, in a blinding flash that was seen across the world, the battle ended. Some say it was the work of the divine, but the dragons of Targon remember. The rift was sealed by the eldest of their kind, known in whispered breaths as the Star Forger. Even they were unaware, however, that when the rift was closed, fragments of corruption fell to the earth below, burying themselves deep within. The gods, however, knew that this conflict was far from over. Their vessels, their aspects, were barely able to fend off the great terror even with their strength combined. They could not over-rely on the Star Forger to save them again, especially since his power had nearly burned the world they sought to protect. Thus, a new solution was devised, a way to instill the mortals of this world with the strength to repel the horrors below the earth when they inevitably returned. From the mountain, a lone warrior descended, the aspect of the sun. They came bearing knowledge of a sacred rite that could transform mere mortals into demigods, a ritual to channel the celestial magics of the sun into a human vessel. In exchange for this miracle, those who underwent the ritual would be tasked with facing the great darkness when it inevitably returned. Many stepped forward to volunteer, and the aspect chose the mightiest and most noble warriors to undergo this sacred transformation. Thus the rite of ascension was born, a process by which mortals sought to become demigods by filling their bodies with the primal magics of the cosmos. Some perished, others went mad. Those with the will to endure, however, were transformed into beings whose might rivaled that of the aspects. These were the first ascended, venerated across the land as holy beings. However, to the deities of Targon, they were merely soldiers, meant to fight against the corruption lurking beneath their land. The Ascended would wait however long it took to fulfill their destined purpose, preparing all the while for that fated day. A century later, that day arrived. The horrors erupted from a great fissure in the ground, pouring out into the world with tremendous hunger. However, the Ascended were ready, meeting the abominations with celestial weapons of their own design. Mightiest among them was the Chalakar, a weapon capable of storing and unleashing vast amounts of power in a variety of ways. The battle was long and hard fought, but in the end, the Ascended managed to fight their way to the invasion's source, sealing the rift and banishing the horrors back from whence they came, a place that came to be known, among many other names, as the Void. With the fighting done, the Ascended had served their purpose. However, knowledge of the sacred rite that had forged them remained. The original sun disk, which had been used in Narimazeth to create the first Ascended, had been destroyed. However, a scholar by the name of Shur uncovered its secrets, as well as those of the Holy Rite. With this knowledge, Shur gained a following, even enticing the Ascended to his cause. He began the construction of a new sun disk, larger than its predecessor, at the heart of the continent. Though Shur would not live to see his great work completed, his legacy would endure. A great city was built to protect this new sun disk, and from it, the Empire of Shurima was born. In time, this empire would go on to span the continent, slowly building an army of demigods that came to be known as the Ascended Host. And yet, paradoxically, the empire was long ruled by immortal descendants of Shur's bloodline, for the truth of ascension was kept a closely guarded secret. Though many revered it as something sacred, it was merely a flawed recreation of a ritual used by Targonians to become aspects. Indeed, the flaws of ascension became apparent with the passage of time. Not only did it often lead to death or madness, but the Ascended themselves still withered with age. Their lifespans could persist for thousands of years, but their flesh and minds still decayed all the same. Such information was carefully guarded from the public, who were led to believe in the divine providence of the sun disk and all it signified. Only an order of sun priests and their oracles could decide who was worthy of ascension. The Chalakar, too, was kept hidden away for many years, for fear of the destruction it could unleash in the wrong hands. The Shuriman Empire continued its expansion, conquering even the mighty nations of Ishtal and Ikathia. With the Ascended Host at its helm, Shurima even began its expansion north into the continent of Valoran. However, it would never go beyond the isthmus where Ashra-Vazan was located. The kingdom of Ikathia had long been known for its rebellion, yet all efforts to shake off Shurima's chains were taken in vain. That is, until Icathian scholars discovered a chasm in the earth, and the ancient evil buried within. Ignorant of the powers they toyed with, the Icathians sought to use this eldritch force to finally overcome the might of the Ascended Host. In the end, they merely spelled their own demise, releasing the Void upon Shurima once again. Thus began the Great Void War. In the face of this grave threat, the Ascended rallied once more. This time, however, they were woefully underprepared. None of the first Ascended remain among their ranks, and those god warriors who served the Empire knew precious little of the Void's terror. This time, the monstrosities ravaged the land, and it was all the Ascended could do, at first, to keep them at bay. Many measures were taken to push back the onslaught, with varying degrees of success. Nizuk, an Ascended sorcerer born in Ishtal, constructed a mighty flying fortress with the elemental magics of his homeland. This monolith rained down fire, storms, shards of earth, and more upon the horrors of the void. Nizuk sought to meet chaos with chaos, though the monolith was ultimately torn from the sky and dragged deep into the earth below. Some legends claim that a shard of its heart remains, struggling against the void even now. One of the mightiest Ascended generals, whose name has been lost to time, charged headlong into the fray. He wielded the Infinity Edge, a blade said to be tempered in the waters of the Oasis of the Dawn. This sacred spring, located within the capital beneath the sun disk, was imbued with arcane properties that could cleanse any impurity. The Infinity Edge, bathed in these waters and inscribed with powerful runes, was said to be capable of cutting even the air itself. It was not enough. The general was overwhelmed and the Infinity Edge lost in the chaos. Many presumed he had perished, but some legends claim that a demonic figure wielding a living sword would later be seen fighting alongside the Ascended during the Great Void War. None can say for sure. Horak, an Ascended scholar, sought to turn the Void's own power against it. He created two gauntlets, one to channel the pure magics of Runeterra, the other to contain the corruption of the Void. Wielding these forces in tandem proved surprisingly effective, allowing Horak to defend his city for over a month before he eventually fell. What became of his gauntlets, none know for certain. All these efforts and many more were taken to keep the Void at bay, but in the end, the horrors were able to make their way to the gates of Shurima's capital. There, the remnants of the Ascended host made a desperate last stand, led by their warrior queen Sataka. By order of the Emperor, she had been given leave to wield the Chalakar in defense of her nation, unleashing the celestial weapon's power for the first time in thousands of years. In spite of this, Sataka proved a natural with the Chalakar, using its magic to empower not just herself, but her allies. The Ascended host fought for days on end, pushing through the chaos and eventually arriving before the great chasm where Acathia once stood. There, Sataka gave her life to unleash all of the Chalakar's power, creating a barrier that the horrors of the Void could not bypass. Though some of its monstrosities still lurked in the desert, the Void had seemingly been contained here, for the time being. Thus, the war came to a conclusion. Shurima had survived, though it would be forever changed. Centuries passed, and the Empire slowly began to rebuild itself under a new, even harsher regime. Those Ascended who had survived the Great Void War were each tasked with overseeing a region of the desert, to ensure that none ever dared to rebel again, crushing any dissent the instant it began. Only two of their number remained within the capital to safeguard the Emperor, the brothers Nasus and Renekton, whose combined strength and tact made them perfectly suited for repelling any potential threats. Or so it seemed. None dared to imagine that a lone prince and a slave would one day do what even the Void could not, bringing an end to Shurima's age-old dynasty. Azir was the youngest son of Emperor Malaka, who ruled Shurima with an iron fist. Malaka aspired to rebuild the empire to even greater heights than it had known even before the Great Void War, and so he made heavy use of slave labor to expand cities and build new monuments in his image. While Azir's elder siblings took after their father in their ambitions for the future, the youngest prince had a greater interest in the past, spending most of his days in archives around the city to study Shuriman history. It was in one of these libraries that Azir met a young slave boy, and his destiny would be forever altered. The boy who came to be known as Zareth was born to slaves from Saikal, who were brought from their home to the capital as part of Emperor Malaka's designs to expand the city. The boy was forced to watch as his parents were worked nearly to death each day, all while being forced to contribute in whatever meager ways he could. The father passed first, and the mother, seeking to spare her son from the same fate, pleaded with one of the architects to take her son on as an apprentice. Despite his reluctance, the architect soon discovered that the boy had an uncanny talent for learning, which could indeed make him a useful assistant. Thus, the slave boy was taken in by the architect and taught the basics of mathematics so that he could assist the new master's work. One day, the slave was sent to a library to retrieve some scrolls for the architect, documents pertaining to an old temple that had been ravaged by the Great Void War. Before the slave could return to his master, though, he was halted by none other than Azir, who sought those same documents to learn about the temple's history. Despite initial tensions between the two boys, they ultimately agreed to pore over the scrolls together, and a fast friendship formed over their shared passions for learning. Azir accompanied his new friend back to the architect and revealed himself as none other than a prince of Shurima, requesting that ownership of the slave boy be transferred to him. Though reluctant, the architect agreed. In secret, the prince named his new friend and servant Zareth, meaning one who shares, to commemorate their first meeting. Though slaves having names was illegal under Emperor Malaka's rule, Azir disregarded his father's law whenever he and Zareth were alone, signifying the bond of trust between them. Though they were officially master and slave, Azir and Zareth were as brothers, often tutoring each other and looking out for one another in a court that regarded neither of them warmly. For years this continued, and the boys even began to study arcane texts away from prying eyes. It was then they discovered that Zareth had an especially potent talent for magic. Azir proposed that he and Zareth travel to the vassal state of Ishtal together to study the arcane, under the pretense of being distant relatives. Zareth was quick to agree to this course of action, but fate had other plans. One day late into their teen years, it happened. A slave uprising in the capital. Revolt spread all throughout the city in a surprisingly organized effort to defy Emperor Malaka's rule. Though the rebellion was quickly suppressed, in large part thanks to Nasus and Renekton, Azir's elder siblings were caught up in the chaos and killed. Suddenly, the youngest and least favored prince was the heir to Shurima's throne. Emperor Malaka was not pleased. Though he tried to fashion Azir into a ruler he believed worthy of such inheritance, Malaka found the boy too soft-hearted. Rumors abounded throughout the court that Malaka would seek to sire new heirs. These rumors were kept well out of earshot from the prince, but not his slave and closest friend. At first, Zara thought to bring this news straight to Azir, but then realized that doing so may do more harm than good. How might Azir react if he knew his own father meant to replace him? What could the young prince even do to thwart the emperor? No, it fell to Zareth alone to protect his friend. He delved deeper than ever into his studies of the arcane, not even making Azir privy to his designs. In ancient forbidden texts hidden deep within the royal archives, Zareth learned all manner of spells and curses that could be used to halt Emperor Malaka's designs. One by one, the emperor's wives succumbed to tragic fates, many of which could be disregarded as accidents. Of course, rumors of a conspiracy were quick to spread among the palace, but Zareth made certain not to leave any clues that could be traced back to himself. Emperor Malaka was not deterred. He simply sought out new wives from Shurima's noble class, and Zareth soon realized that murdering his concubines was not enough. To ensure Azir's safety, the prince's father had to die. Not long after this realization, Emperor Malaka passed from a mysterious illness, and Azir was crowned the new emperor of Shurima. What should have been a joyous occasion, however, filled Azir with unease. Not only did he mourn his father's passing, Azir knew that it was no mere accident. As ever, it was Zareth who came to reassure the prince in his time of doubt. This, Zareth reasoned, must be the work of destiny. Emperor Malaka's cruel reign must have angered the gods, and so they paved the way for Azir to take the throne, that he may be a greater ruler than Malaka could have ever been. Though skeptical, Zareth's words struck a chord with Azir, and the prince accepted his coronation, even going so far as to name his slave as Grand Magus, advisor in all manners arcane. This was unprecedented, but Azir was quick to silence any dissent. He was, after all, the emperor chosen by the gods. His will, then, must surely be the will of the divine. Thus Azir set about establishing his reign with Zareth at his side. The newly appointed Grand Magus accepted his position gladly, but seeds of doubt started to take root inside of him. Those seeds only grew as the years passed, and Zareth faced ridicule and discrimination from all sides. One day, Zareth approached Azir in private to ask a boon. Though appointed to a high-ranking position in the royal court, Zareth was still technically a slave. All that he had, including his name and even his own life, were property of Azir. None within the royal court regarded him with the authority that a Grand Magus should possess, and so Zareth asked that Azir free him and grant him citizenship. Deep inside, Azir wanted nothing more than to grant this request. However, years on the throne had taught him a number of things. Even if destiny itself favored him, Azir knew that liberating his own slave would set a dangerous precedent. He might inspire other slaves throughout the city, perhaps even the Empire, to revolt again or demand that they, too, be raised up as Zareth had been. A slave's appointment to Grand Magus had already tested the waters. And so, with a heavy heart but a stern face, Azir declined Zareth's request. The doubt inside Zareth turned to rage. For years, he had been a loyal friend and servant to Azir. For years, Zareth had endured ridicule and risked his life for the one he called a brother. Now, this simple request, to regain what had been taken from him, was disregarded with such indifference by the one he trusted most. Zareth would not stand for this. He would have his freedom, one way or another. Zareth once again dove deep into the ancient archives, where he discovered a most curious record, an account of Renekton's ascension, which had not been ordained by the Sun Priests. The rite of ascension, which many believed only those chosen by the will of the gods themselves could endure, was not nearly so divine as some believed. Perhaps, then, it was not beyond the realm of possibility that a slave might acquire such power as well. Zareth began to formulate his plan. Through careful suggestion, he planted the idea in Azir's mind that perhaps he was destined for greater things. The gods had cleared the path for Azir to take the throne, and his reign had been a prosperous one. Surely, such prosperity was meant to last for eternity, if only there were a way to ensure that Azir's reign never ended. It wasn't long until Azir, who had never been made privy to the truth of ascension, sought the coveted power for himself. The emperor met with the Sun Priest and demanded that the rite be prepared for him. Though reluctant, the Sun Priest relented on fear of death for defying the emperor. None dared to reveal the truth to Azir, that this ritual could lead to his death or descent into madness. To do so would mean exposing the falsehoods at the heart of Shurima's very culture. Zareth watched as his plan unfolded from the shadows. But there were two potential complications. The brothers Nasus and Renekton, who knew the truth and would not be afraid to expose the folly of Azir's ambition. To keep them silent, Zareth used his magic to summon several powerful spirits around the capital, forcing Nasus and Renekton to divert their attention toward these threats. All the while, the preparations for the rite continued apace. However, word would eventually, inevitably reach the brothers' ears. By the time it did, though, it was too late. The day of ascension arrived, but as Nasus and Renekton rushed back to the capital to intervene, they were halted by an ancient demon of fire named Tybulk, who had been released from its ancient prison by the Magus to ensure that the brothers kept their distance. As the god warriors and the demon clashed, Azir stepped onto the dais, ready to begin the ritual. Before he did, Azir shocked all onlookers, including the Magus himself, by declaring that Zareth was to be given full citizenship and all the rights that came with it. Azir smiled down upon his friend, knowing fully well that as God Emperor none would dare challenge his final decree as immortal. Azir claimed that he trusted Xerath to continue his faithful service before stepping forward to stand beneath the might of the sun disk. Xerath was stunned, but only for a moment. He was free, but he had spent his entire life in service already. What's more, there was no hope of hiding his crimes once Nasus and Renekton returned to the capital. Azir's declaration had come too late. If Xerath was to ever know real freedom, he needed the power of a god. Xerath stepped forward, channeling all the power he could muster into a single mighty curse. An ominous light shot forth, encasing Azir in stone just as the Emperor was about to begin the ritual. Xerath's own vision blurred, but he continued forward, casting Azir off the dais and into the great crevice below. Guards rushed forth, but they were much too slow. Xerath began his incantation, invoking the ancient words that called forth the celestial magic stored within the sun disk. A beam of light shot down and enveloped the Magus. Pain flooded Xerath's senses. His flesh burned, his blood boiled, his bones began to turn to dust. However, Xerath refused to die. He had come too far and sacrificed too much to be stopped now. Even as his lungs failed him, Xerath cried out in defiant rage, willing the celestial magics into the very core of his being. The light continued to pour down, draining the sun disk of all its magic. Raw energy erupted across the capital. The people fled, though only a few were able to escape the maelstrom of chaos. The city collapsed, and the sun disk fell from the sky. On that day, a lone slave had accomplished even what the void could not: the fall of Shurima. When the dust settled, a lone figure emerged from the rubble, a being of pure, violent, pulsing energy. Xerath beheld the world as he had never seen it before, through the eyes of one that perceived the arcane itself. Even in the wake of tragedy, the Magus could only laugh, for he was now free in the truest possible sense. In the distance, Nasus and Renekton saw the maelstrom of chaos engulfing the capital. Though they had nearly subdued Tybalk, the brothers knew that they had bigger priorities. They had a choice to make, between rushing to the city or seeking the aid of the other Ascended. Renekton chose the former, leaving Nasus with little choice but to follow. The heroes rushed to the heart of the ruined capital, where they found Xerath cackling madly to himself. What followed was a battle that could be both seen and heard across the desert. Nasus and Renekton fought with all the power they could muster, but Xerath's magic was greater even than the mighty flame demon they had fought previously. The Curator concocted a plan, racing into the depths of the ruined capital while Renekton held the line. When he returned, Nasus carried with him an enchanted sarcophagus designed to seal powerful spirits and demons. The brothers managed to trap Xerath within, and the battle seemed won. However, even this sarcophagus could not hold Xerath for long. The brothers watched in horror as it began to crack from the sheer strain of Xerath's power. In desperation, Renekton grabbed the sarcophagus, racing deep into the catacombs beneath the capital. Nasus followed as quickly as he could, already deducing his brother's plan. There was but a single thing that could contain the Magus now: the Tomb of the Emperors, which could be sealed in times of emergency with a potent spell even Xerath could not break. Renekton hurled the sarcophagus into the tomb, but just as he did, the prison shattered. Though pieces still clung to Xerath's figure, the Magus was quick to try to escape the tomb, knowing fully well what his adversaries planned. Desperate, Renekton lunged forward, keeping the Magus at bay with his sheer strength. He pleaded for Nasus to close the door, understanding that doing so would mean Renekton might be trapped for eternity with this traitor. With a heavy heart, Nasus obliged, condemning his brother and enemy alike to the darkness. The door sealed itself, and could only be opened again with the fabled Chalakar, a weapon buried in the lost tomb of Sataka. Nasus returned to the surface to find the rest of the ascended host standing before the remnants of the capital. Though racked with grief over his brother's fate, Nasus told them all of what had transpired as best he could. A long silence followed before the bickering began. These loyal warriors of Shurima, gathered together for the first time in an age since the Great Void War, were now lost. The empire they had protected for centuries, which many thought to be invincible, had been toppled in a single day. Some believed they should seek out Azir's next of kin to restore the royal dynasty, while others believed that the time of mortal emperors was long past. A schism formed within the ascended host, which in time exploded into an all-out war. The ascended host was no more. Now, the Sunborn, as they came to be called, warred with each other for control over the remnants of their own empire. For hundreds of years they battled, taking and retaking territories from each other time and again in an endless, vicious cycle. On occasion, one may slay the other, but the war as a whole seemed locked in a cruel stalemate. At some point, the war became less about restoring Shurima in any form, and more about the stubborn refusal from any faction to concede. Nasus retreated from the desert altogether, secluding himself somewhere none would be able to find him. He grieved the loss of his brother, as well as the state of the desert. He saw that his friends and allies had become warmongers and tyrants, unworthy of the ascended name, and sought no part in their feud. Nasus, however, was not the only one to realize such folly. After hundreds of years, the Sunborn warrior Tanari came to see the error in this conflict, and sought a means to end it. Surprisingly, he was approached by a mysterious woman with multicolored eyes, who claimed she could help him in this endeavor. The woman introduced herself as Maisha, and shockingly, she bore the Chalakar in her hands. This, she claimed, would be the key to uniting the ascended host once more. Together, Maisha and Tanari worked to gather the Sunborn together in one place. Though many came reluctantly, rumors of the Chalakar inevitably drew all factions together in the ancient city of Narimazeth, near the base of Mount Targon. There, Tanari pleaded his case, using the Chalakar as a symbol to remind the Sunborn of what they once were: defenders, heroes, and champions of Shurima. Together they had fended off the void and raised Shurima up into the greatest nation the world had ever known. Apart, they were little more than feuding tyrants to be feared and reviled. Tanari's words touched the hearts of some, but others were too blinded by greed and ambition. It was the warrior Sabataro who ignited the fighting, seeking to claim the Chalakar as his own. As Sabataro reached for the sacred blade, however, it left Tanari's hands for Maisha's. The woman's hair erupted in a myriad of colors like the shimmering heavens themselves, and her true identity became known: the aspect of twilight, harbinger of change. Maisha held the Chalakar aloft, and a brilliant radiance poured forth from it. The light enveloped the Sunborn and their mortal armies, drawing their spirits, their very essence, into the weapon. As promised, the ascended host was now once again as one, forever bound to the celestial blade by the trickster god. Maisha left the empty amphitheater of Narimazeth behind, returning the blade to its resting place in Sataka's tomb, to await the day that it would again be needed. Centuries passed, and the Shuriman Empire, along with the Ascended, faded into legend. What remained was a mostly barren land divided between disparate settlements, wandering nomads, bandits, and treasure hunters. Among the latter was a woman named Sivir, who became known as one of the fiercest tomb raiders of her time. She was an expert at plundering ancient catacombs, selling their contents to the highest bidder for coin. One evening, one of Sivir's informants came to her with rumors of a recently discovered tomb, believed to belong to an ancient warrior queen. Some said it might even be the final resting place of one of the fabled Ascended. Though Sivir had never put much stock in the ancient stories, a newly discovered tomb meant undiscovered riches, and she was intent on claiming whatever she could before anyone else. When Sivir reached the tomb, she couldn't help but admire its splendor. a pristine chamber decorated with hieroglyphs of an inhuman warrior facing what appeared to be a horde of monsters. At the far end of the chamber stood a sarcophagus roughly twice the size of an average person, and carved in the visage of a great feline. The sarcophagus sat upright, and a peculiar cross-shaped blade hovered before it, suspended by some kind of magic. Sivir could almost feel the feline's gaze bearing down on her, as if challenging her to take its treasure. For the first time, she felt as though the old legends may have a sliver of truth to them. But Sivir would not be deterred. She carefully worked her way past the myriad of traps that littered the room, using her years of experience and knowledge of old Shuriman architecture to close the distance between herself and her prize. Despite many close calls, the treasure hunter finally made her way to the sarcophagus and snatched the weapon from its resting place. The moment she did, a peculiar word echoed in Sivir's mind: Chalakar. It was like hearing another's voice inside her own head, and the thought left Sivir feeling uneasy. Before Sivir could dwell on it, one final trap sprung to life, a small army of golems that seemed intent on keeping Sivir from leaving. With the blade in hand, she effortlessly pushed past the ancient constructs, wielding the weapon with a strange sense of ease, as though it were meant for her. Sivir pushed such thoughts aside and returned to the surface, taking the weapon called the Chalakar as her own. With the blade in hand, Sivir's reputation only grew, and whole scores of rival thieves and bandits were swiftly put down. In time, she came to be known as the Battle Mistress, leading her own band of treasure hunters in the process. One fateful day, Sivir's band was approached by a messenger from Belzun, requesting her aid on behalf of a Noxian noblewoman named Cassiopeia. The noblewoman sought an escort to the ruined, forsaken capital, at the heart of the desert, a place where many treasure hunters had staked their claim, yet precious few had ever returned from. Said to be filled with deadly traps and curses and haunted by the vengeful spirits of the dead, the old capital of the Shurima Empire had become the heart of many rumors and ghost stories. Sivir, however, remained undeterred by such superstitions. Though not normally keen to bring her clients along with her, Cassiopeia offered an exorbitant price for the chance to see the ruins firsthand. Sivir relented, knowing that she could just loot the money off the noblewoman's corpse if she happened to get herself killed. After a long and arduous journey, Sivir and her band arrived before the ruins. Though some were reluctant to delve too deep into this forsaken place, neither Sivir nor Cassiopeia were deterred by superstitious rumors. Together, both women began their descent into the crater where the capital once stood, accompanied by Sivir's band. At first, the journey was slow, but easy enough for one as experienced as Sivir. As the group descended deeper, they began to encounter more traps, curses, and even strange creatures unlike anything they'd ever seen, abominations that appeared to be warped by some kind of twisted magic. The ruins, too, steadily became more and more distorted. Azure energy pulsed along the walls and ground, and chunks of debris were left suspended in the air. Sivir pushed through it all with their Chalakar in hand, yet even she could feel a growing sense of unease the deeper they went. There hardly seemed to be anything worth plundering in this place, yet Cassiopeia insisted they were on the right track. Deep beneath the capital summited a treasure beyond compare, she claimed. Despite their skepticism, Sivir and her band continued onward. Finally, the party arrived before a massive stone door inscribed with runes. In the center of the door was a lock that housed an impression of the Chalakar, much to Sivir's surprise. The battle mistress approached the door with Cassiopeia in tow, but just before they reached the lock, the path behind them sealed itself shut. Stone serpents lining the room opened their mouths, and noxious gas poured forth. Suddenly, the Chalakar reacted to Sivir's instincts, forming a mystical barrier that protected both herself and Cassiopeia from the gas. The others, however, were not so fortunate. Sivir watched in horror as her band succumbed to the choking fumes, falling dead in less than a minute as their flesh melted from their bodies. As the gas began to dissipate and the barrier faded, Cassiopeia drew a knife from her belt and plunged it into Sivir's back. The Noxian smiled as the Chalakar fell to the ground and quickly snatched it up. This, she claimed, was for the best. Cassiopeia had no intention of sharing what was to be found in this ancient tomb, the secret to the rite of ascension, which could transform mortals into demigods. Cassiopeia placed the Chalakar into the lock, and the ancient seal was broken. Sivir watched, horrified, as the doors of the tomb burst open. Cassiopeia stumbled back, and a massive armored crocodile loomed over her. Renekton let out a cry of triumph, finally freed from his ancient torment. Trapped alone with Xerath for millennia, the Ascended General's mind had nearly been completely shattered. Through a mix of magic and manipulation, the Magus had convinced Renekton that his own brother had betrayed him, and trapped him both within the Tomb of the Emperors, wanting to take sole credit for saving the Empire. Now, Renekton desired but one thing: revenge. As the butcher raced from the tomb, Xerath slowly followed, accompanied by a small army of Bakai, monsters created by infusing his own magic into the deceased. During his long isolation, Xerath had transformed the corpses within the tomb, and then allowed his magic to slowly seep out and infest those who had died in the capital centuries ago. He had intended for them to break the seal on his behalf, but never imagined that two mortal women might be the key to his long-awaited freedom. Xerath stared down at Cassiopeia, who gazed back with a mix of confusion, anger, awe, and fear. Xerath had heard her wish from beyond the door, that she sought the power of an Ascended. As a reward for freeing him, she would have it, but not in the way she wanted. Sivir watched in horror as Xerath unleashed his magic upon Cassiopeia, transforming her just as he had transformed the dead throughout the capital. The Noxian's lower body elongated. Her nails became vicious claws, and scales covered her flesh. Cassiopeia's agonized cries filled the ruins, but Sivir had greater concerns. If the blood loss didn't kill her, these ancient monsters would. Mustering all the strength she could, Sivir snatched up the Chalakar from where it had been thrown onto the ground, and fled into the ruins. Cassiopeia nearly gave chase, but Xerath commanded her to leave the matter alone. This other woman was of no concern. The remaining Vakai could deal with her. They had more pressing matters to attend to, as the time had finally come for Xerath to claim rulership of the world that had tried so hard to imprison him. As Xerath marched out of the ruins with his new army in tow, Sivir fled deeper into the darkness. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to find a different path up to the surface. Her wound ached in protest, and Bakai skulked the darkness, but Sivir pressed onward. She would not die here. There were stories, rumors of an ancient oasis beneath the capital that could heal any injury or cleanse any impurity. She just had to find it. Just as Sivir felt her strength starting to wane, she saw a shaft of sunlight from up ahead. Soon the battle mistress emerged into a great underground chamber, at the center of which was a pool of the most pristine water she'd ever seen. Sivir dragged herself forward, and let herself drop into the oasis just as her vision started to fade. When next her eyes opened, Sivir wasn't sure how much time had passed. From the position of the sunlight pouring in through the cracks, she guessed a day or more. Sivir inspected her wound, only to find that it was completely healed. Evidently, the Ascended weren't the only legends with a degree of truth to them. That said, Sivir now faced a new conundrum. Those mad demigods were free, and likely running amok in Shurima even now. Sivir contemplated what to do next as she pulled herself out of the water, only to notice a figure lying on the ground nearby. It looked like a statue of a man, but it was in abnormally pristine condition. Sivir moved to inspect it and somehow sensed the presence of dark magic. Realization dawned on her. This was no mere statue, but a person who had been turned to stone. It had to be some sort of curse, probably the work of that arcane entity from before. After a long moment of contemplation, Sivir dragged the cursed man into the water, and watched as the stone slowly sprung back to life. The stranger gasped for air, likely his first breath in ages, and looked around in confusion. He spoke to Sivir in an ancient tongue she barely understood, but the two could feel a strange connection between them. Suddenly, the stranger's eyes fell upon the Chalakar. Sivir instinctively stepped back, keeping the Chalakar out of the stranger's reach, but the weapon moved on its own. It leaped from Sivir's hand into the stranger's. The moment he touched it, a golden radiance flowed from the weapon, encompassing the man's body as he was lifted slowly into the air. Azir could feel the essence of the ascended host filling him, the strength and memories of all those god warriors who had perished in Narimazeth centuries ago. Long had they been dormant within the Chalakar, waiting for someone to awaken and command their spirits once more. Finally, that day had come, for their emperor had returned. The Chalakar fell to the ground, and Sivir snatched it up as she watched the stranger descend. Yet it was not the same man from before. No, he was not a man at all. A regal hawk now stood before Sivir, clad in golden armor. He announced himself as Azir, now speaking the modern tongue fluently, and declared his thanks to Sivir for freeing him. Sivir was wary of his thanks, having witnessed firsthand how these Ascended showed their gratitude. When Azir asked for elaboration, Sivir explained the events that had led up to this moment, and warned Azir of the peril that had been unleashed upon Shurima. Understanding dawned upon Azir. He knew the being of magic she described must be Zareth, the traitor who had denied him his destined ascension so long ago. But destiny would not be halted, for it was clear that he had been revived for this very purpose, to stop the Magus and rebuild Shurima greater than before, with the collective power of the entire ascended host flowing through him, as well as their armies. Azir raised his hands, and shimmering sand rose up around him to flood through the remnants of the capital. Ruined structures rebuilt themselves. The Magus' corrupting magic abated. Apparitions of ancient soldiers manifest throughout the city, slaughtering any Bakai that still lingered. Even the sun disk, long drained of its power, was restored to its rightful place in the sky. In a day, Zareth had destroyed the heart of the Shuriman Empire. In a day, Azir had revived it. For as miraculous as this feat was, however, Sivir remained wary. Azir seemed to think it was destined that he should return to rule Shurima once more, but the battle mistress had never put stock in destiny. In truth, she couldn't help this nagging feeling like there was more at play here. But it didn't matter. She would be no one's pawn, not even that of a god or fate itself. While Azir busied himself with restoring the capital, Sivir fled, taking the Chalakar with her. This weapon had proved a great deal of trouble recently, but she felt it was better in her hands than any self-righteous demigod's. Who knew what else it was capable of? Perhaps, if it was the start of this whole mess, it could also be the key to ending it. The capital's rise was seen all across Shurima. From the ruins of Narimazeth, Zareth watched with fury. From an isolated library in the desert, Nasus watched in disbelief. From every corner of the land, the people beheld the rebirth of the old empire. Some wept, others celebrated. A few cowered in fear. One thing was clear to all, however. The war for Shurima's future had begun, and its outcome would change the course of history forever.